Free trade agreements in the United States have never really gotten popular support. So there is a long history behind it. We have seen the trade unions supporting free trade in the 50s and 60s for reasons of anti-communism and strengthening so Western Europe, the capitalist Western Europe. But at the end of the 60s, it became clear that the US corporations like to outsource, and the trade unions then switched sides, and most all of them were no longer for further free trade, more liberalization of the economy there. That was then a moment where they actually tried to stop globalization in its start. And they mounted a huge campaign under the Nixon administration, but were not successful. And what happened was really that on the capital side, where part of capital, and especially originally before the war, a lot of capital was more for protectionism, had moved to the other side, and there was really one big bank of corporate interest for further liberalization, because they saw it as a way to sidetrack organized labor and to have their freedom. So it was really a very classical class issue, the further liberalization of American trade. And what they did then, as they noticed that the US population is not really behind them, is always linking further steps with a pride in American leadership. So it was always linked to American leadership. And it somehow also carried into the post-Soviet times, into the 90s, so it was possible then to have the WTO, first with the NAFTA and then the WTO. However, they were voted in what is called the lame duck period, where the ones who have been voted into the office 2 years before or 6 years before, depending whether Senate or Congress, are on their way out, but still have the right to vote. And that is between the elections and mid-January, in this period. And so it also shows you that it had been always very contested. And now we have seen in the last elections that it was possible to mobilize these kind of feelings of people against the initiatives, especially on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership was an attempt very much driven by corporate America to encircle China. And having then Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, you name it, together, and trying to set the corporate agenda there, and at the same time also negotiating with Europe for a transatlantic partnership, and hoping that if the TPP, the Pacific, is finished a bit earlier than the Atlantic one, that one can use the might of that for bringing Europe on course for the American corporate agenda. So that was, in a way, the idea. And how it works is, of course, that in trade negotiations, without any other power dimensions, just on the level of market access, those who have the larger market, more purchasing power, are in a stronger position, because the others want to have access to this higher level of purchasing power. Right. So if you are able to find rules for a huge area, including Japan and Malaysia, then for the Europeans it would have been difficult to not go along with American demands. So that was in a way the plan. But it didn't work out because it was possible within the United States to mobilize anti-trade feelings that had been around for a long time. And they always had also a specific racist connotation in that. So we have seen lots of mobilization against the original NAFTA, and it really, there was a lot of maneuvering necessary to bring NAFTA through Congress at the time. That was very, very difficult, but they succeeded with a lot of tricks and so on. So that was now mobilized in 2016 there. And the question is what to do. And Trump developed a different strategy. And the strategy is now coming to the fore. One can more clearly see what kind of strategy is being pursued. And that is a strategy of bilateral deals, you know. And in a bilateral relationship, the US is always the bigger one. And therefore the others have to go along. In the beginning, we were a little bit astounded that Trump was hitting everyone, you know, the Canadians, the Mexicans, the Germans, and so on there. Why not building an alliance with these countries against China? Because that's the main objective there. But it became clear that by then hitting on Mexico and Canada, it was possible to further the agenda. And when you now look at the agreement that has been negotiated with Mexico and Canada came to it, you will see that a lot of corporate demands are fulfilled. It starts, of course, with intellectual property rights. From 50 years to 70 years, biologics are in it for 10 years now. Then the data transfer, I think a very important topic for Europe. No localization, so data can be processed wherever there is. So American big digital companies have freedom, and I have argued that that's also extremely important for the medical complex, the data then of people's health conditions there, and so on. So, and that can be now processed wherever American companies want to do so. And the list goes on. So a lot of the corporate demands have found their way into the NAFTA. Renegotiations, which has now a new name. The name is not yet really settled, but it looks like it is the US-Mexico-Canadian agreement, US-Mexico, and this agreement then has an interesting component which should then neutralize the trade unions. Right. So that's in a way why I started out with the demagoguing. So Trump is saying we are holding up for American workers, but the key elements of the agreements are all what American corporations wanted in the first place anyhow. Yeah. But there is now something tiny in it, and that is that the rules of origin are expanded in the auto industry there, slightly, not much. And then there is a very innovative part which we might want to emulate if it would be seriously meant. And that is that 40% now of the product crossing into the United States in the auto industry has to be manufactured by those who earn at least $16 an hour. That, in a way, looks like, oh, that would give Mexican workers now the chance to move up from $2 an hour there. However, about 3/8 of the can be then counted through engineering departments. So it is not necessarily the assembly workers' wages. No, the assembly worker wages are combined with the wages of the engineering departments, and then it has to come on average to $16. In the end, it will still probably lead to a bit higher wages for Mexican workers, which is of course to be much welcomed there. But we'll have to see whether that is actually the end or not, or whether there is more of that than saying, well, we really enforce the wages, but in real terms, then the wages of highly paid knowledge workers are integrated into the formula. That has to be seen. So there is this kind of an aspect where Trump then can say, it is for workers, and where the trade unions might come along. And that there is a chance to get this agreement through Congress, independent of whether the Republicans now lose the midterm elections or not. You know that. And so, by this kind of a shift of strategy, US corporate alliances have made a huge step forward. They were really able to have this kind of an agenda on intellectual property rights, on data, and so on. These public procurement, also very important, which was not part of the NAFTA agreement before. These kind of what we used to call the Singapore issues, in a way, are in it. And then there is a nice little anti-China component too, which is a little bit contested. The Canadians say it's not really in it, and the Mexicans say, yes, it is in it, but it's not really so dangerous there. And what is this component? This component is that if the Mexicans or Canadians would pursue agreement, free trade agreement with the Chinese, the US can step out of the North American free trade zone. And if they step out, that will of course then lead to a major upheaval. So they cannot step. So in a way, the US has put in a brake for side agreements in a way with China. And so it is really a first step, but differently achieved of what was supposed to be achieved under Obama, meaning the encircling of China, and then forcing upon China these kind of issues, which include, and that is also part of the new agreement, which also include language on state-owned companies, that state-owned companies should also behave like market players there. And that was also a very major demand of corporate America in the trade rounds. Now, as you are in lobby control, you might also want to know a little bit about the lobbying there. That this field was always contested there, the field of trade. And in order to safeguard the free trade agenda, the president had more powers. Because it was assumed, and that was also until Trump, in a way, the reality that the president, for geopolitical reasons, would be more for free trade and would be a check on the congressional representatives who might get a lot of pressure from their constituencies in the Midwest or wherever, you know, and to safeguard in a way the trade agenda against these kind of grounds-up questioning of liberalizing strategy there. So so the big fear was now, of course, that if Trump is espousing such a protectionist strategy, that now suddenly things move the other way around, so that this safeguard against protectionist demands from Congress is no longer there. That suddenly the protectionists have captured the key player, the presidency there. But I think a lot of insiders were not so afraid, because the business model of Trump is a model of internationalism there. He gets dirty money from the Russians and others there. His main business has been in the last years to sell his name. And while he was hitting on China, the Chinese government gave his companies the protection for his brand name for all kinds of funny things, where he can now put also his name Trump on it. So he lives of intellectual property protection abroad. So it's quite clear that he would also push for that. And he is known to have his own interests always on the fore. So from that kind of way, one could already imagine that it is more demagogy that he is pursuing than a real populism, what that is. But Congress and the business community also reacted. First of all, at the very beginning of his presidency, some of the Republicans had some ideas of a border tax, they called that, and that would have then limited the possibilities of easily moving around products across borders. And here then a few companies were very much behind that, like Boeing and so on. But all the other companies, like the Walmarts, they then formed a huge coalition, and that showed that this kind of hardcore protectionism would not fly, that corporate America is able to build ad hoc a very broad coalition and was able to defeat this idea very quickly. That was gone there. This border tax idea was gone very quickly. Of course, corporate America is a little bit worried there. It starts, of course, with the immigration policies there, where many of them live off Indian engineers and people from other countries coming into the country there. And of course, the individual company may also fear a little bit this new tactic, which might then endanger their profits, because it's a stick that is wielded, and one doesn't quite know to what extent now then Trump would go to raise tariffs, and thereby also, of course, then hurting individual American companies. But that was also a very clever strategy, that before Trump really got serious about trade, he gave corporate America the tax cuts, massive tax cuts. And therefore, they basically stayed quiet. That's kind of the tactic. Now, but to make sure that Trump is not overplaying the cards, now corporate America has enlisted many Republicans also, not just Democrats, mainly Republicans, that have then formulated a bill and were announcing that they would try to push this bill through Congress that would take away some of the instruments in the hands of the presidency in the trade arena, especially all these inquiries that can then lead to higher tariffs if the inquiry feels that the other countries have cheated on one way or another. And here they mobilized in Congress and saying, so if Trump is doing too much along those lines, then we will push this bill and try to limit the powers of the presidency. Because in the end, from the Constitution, actually, the power rests with Congress. Only, as I mentioned before, over many, many decades, the process was that one tries to limit the power of Congress in order to allow for liberalization in policies. And now if there's the threat that the roles are reversed, the president might get more protectionist, then it was already mobilized in Congress to keep a check on him. The lobby activities of corporate America are in a way institutionalized because the office of the trade representative has advisory committees and these advisory committees are, I think, as corporate Europe has shown for the European Union, to 95% stacked with people out of the business community. And there may be, in some of these committees, there may be a labor representative, and in another maybe a consumer representatives and so on. I have not checked that in recent times, but when I look closer at it, for example, the representative of consumer interests, they were not the famous consumer interest organizations. And then I actually visited this office, and it was very clear that it was a front office for corporate interests. So it was not a consumer interest organization, or that organization had been set up by corporations to represent the consumers in the trade arena there. So that is, in a way, the official institutionalized one. And that is, in a way, extremely important, because in negotiations, it is key how you start, that who is setting the negotiating agenda. And that's why they usually do that behind closed doors. And we can protest once they start negotiating, but then the agenda has been set. And we know that from Europe too. So this institutionalized access of corporate America to the trade agenda is key. But as I mentioned, if that process is disrupted by, for example, this Mr. Trump, then corporate America, of course, can mobilize and try to influence, of course, Congress. And there are very few limits anymore, so that these kind of limits that have been put into place, especially after the Nixon years, have been whittled down. And nowadays there's hardly any upper limit to what corporations can spend in trying to influence the political process. The problem, in a way, is a bit the trade unions there. And they would be, in a way, the key counterforce for more liberalization. Unfortunately, American trade unions have not such a good reputation around the world because they have not done a lot of alliance building. The alliance building was always under the theme of anti-communism until the end of the Soviet Union there. And while some trade unions have overcome that and have done interesting campaigns across borders, a lot of others are more or less still a bit in that mind frame, very much focused on their immediate interest in the country itself, not reaching out much. And that is especially true for the crafts unions that have this kind of a mentality. But also the ones who are organizing more ordinary workers are into this direction sometimes, and especially now in the Trump years, as the Trump demagogy is reaching into their membership. That's a big problem for the trade unions, that he is successful with a segment, not all, but with a significant segment of their members. And so it is quite likely that they will actually support Trump now, because they see the $16 rule, they see the rule for the 40%, no, not the 40%, now the 75% of rules of origin for the automobiles. Then also there's a certain amount, I think that's even 80% of the steel has to come from within the NAFTA area and cannot come from China or so on. That these kind of elements in the new trade agreement with Mexico and Canada will neutralize or even bring them on board for this agreement, overlooking the other dimensions that are furthering the corporate agenda.